Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with another class examination. This time I'm tackling the Pyromancer, which is specifically the combination of Demolitionist and Occultist. Now, this particular combination I'm playing through as my second walkthrough as a directed improv, which is not going particularly well, if you haven't watched that series, simply because I don't have the equipment to back this up really. The long-term equipment setup, basically. So, what this comes down to is, you do have a lot of interesting options that you can do to play around with this. What's fairly interesting is that for this particular combination, there are quite a few abilities that work really well together, and unlike the Soldier, which pretty much had very consistent abilities that you can sit down and say, hey, these are always worth considering, that's not really the case for the Demolitionist or the Occultist. In this particular combination, the abilities you should always be really, at least considering and integrating into your build would be Blackwater Cocktail, Thermite Mine, and Fire Strike. For Occultist, the abilities that you really want to seriously think about are Hellhound, Sail's Witchfire, and Sigil of Consumption. Now there's very specific reasons why these skills are the ones that I would sit down and very seriously consider. For the Hellhound, yes, it's a pet. Yes, you may or may not be enhancing it, but at the end of the day, you can get Hellfire out of it, which can increase your fire and chaos damage, which this combination does a lot of fire and chaos damage. That goes without saying with the nature of the combination, quite obviously. Now, the reason why Sail's Witchfire is really nice is because when combined with Fire Strike, which does fire, a lot of fire, and eventually does chaos damage, you can really slap large amounts of damage in here, especially with the increased attack speed that the first one offers. Even if you just slapped in points in this part for the attack speed, the bonus chaos damage, and the increased vitality damage, you're not going to be so badly off. But, quite frankly, second rate's increase in chaos damage is even more useful, and that vitality resistance is really nice as well. Furthermore, it provides you with some nice flat vitality damage, which will, of course, be pulling off of Sail's Witchfire. So overall, I do really like the Fire Strike Sail's Witchfire combination on this class. It is very potent, especially in the late game once you get Brimstone, and then you can really start to slap people pretty effectively with that. Obviously, Sigil of Consumption, besides being a pretty effective source of health drain here, you also can increase its damage output across the board with the fire and the chaos and the vitality. You can grab Flame Touch to just boost your fire damage across the board, be it for you or your Hellhound. So that's fairly nice, but not necessarily quite as all-encompassing. I do like Thermite Mine a little bit better because a little bit more than Flame Touch, because Flame Touch only increases the fire damage, whereas if you decide to go all the way to Hellfire Mine, not only are you doing fire and chaos damage, which you're already going to be increasing anyways, but you reduce chaos resistance and elemental resistance, and of course elemental resistance includes fire. So there is that pretty major benefit. Furthermore, in a straight up mano-a-mano fight, these last quite a long time. 18 seconds is a really long time to be blasting someone for damage. So this really stacks up. It doesn't seem like a lot of damage right there with 218 fire damage and 232 burn damage over 2 seconds, but considering that this is triggering 18 times, it can get pretty ridiculous. And again, it's reducing their resistance to all elements by 30%. And again, if you're using Hellfire Mine, it's reducing their Chaos and Aether resistance by 35% and doing chaos damage and extra fire damage. It's a pretty magical time. Now, the only thing that I would really say about Hellfire and Thermite Mine specifically, at the very least, Thermite Mine will be useful. Hellfire Mine is a little less useful because obviously this combination doesn't pull any Aether damage. It does not inflict any Aether damage at all. Period. So, unless you have an ally that is doing Aether damage, maybe this isn't the ideal skill. That's entirely up to you whether or not you can justify putting points into a skill you're not going to be using 100% of. But what's always a good investment is Blackwater Cocktail. First off, you're reducing their offensive ability. If you go into high potency, which I strongly recommend you do, you're slowing them down, doing more damage. Get Demon Fire, you're reducing their damage. By a percentage, by the way. This is not a flat damage reduction. This is a percentage of their damage. This is 15%. That's pretty impressive. And then Agonizing Flames reduces their resistances even further. Now, obviously combining Hellfire Mine with Agonizing Flames is quite the nifty little combination, and that's very potent. But even if you don't use Hellfire Mine, Blackwater Cocktail for this specific combination is abnormally powerful, and I really do recommend you at least very strongly consider this. Fire Strike, if you're not going to be using the default, if you're not going to be using weapon attacks, maybe you don't use this, but I don't know of a single time where I haven't used my weapon attacks at least some of the time, and quite frankly, this gets absolutely ridiculous right here. You're talking about 5 to 7 fragments per shot. Now, this is assuming a ranged attack. There is a caveat, of course, if you're not using guns, which you could choose not to use guns. If you choose not to use guns, I would probably stop at about Explosive Strike. You could still go to Brimstone. It still could work. But if you're going to be using a melee weapon, go up to Explosive Strike, grab Searing Might or Searing Strike, whichever one you're using. Both are great, but if you're using a gun, even if it's just a pistol, you're shooting your shots. Your shots are exploding to 5 to 7 fragments per shot, plus 15% attack speed from Slail's Witchfire by the time that's maxed. This is, of course, assuming you aren't equipped with anything that is increasing this further. That's a completely different conversation, depending on how high past 12 you're increasing it. But you get 15% attack speed increase here, add in any attack speed that you might be getting from your items, and you will find yourself doing large quantities of fragment damage. Tons of fragments. It is absolutely ridiculous how much damage you can really pull off with Brimstone. Now, that being said, there is also a couple of other alternatives you could really turn to. This just happens to be my favorite way of playing the combination, but by no means are you restricted or forced into Fire and Chaos as a combination. You could very easily focus on Lightning and Fire, and if you were going to go into Lightning and Fire, you would be going into the Crow instead, and probably Curse of Frailty Vulnerability. That's up to you. You could. Regardless of how you build, Curse of Frailty and or Vulnerability can be very effective, potentially. Again, that's really up to you. But if you're going to go with the Fire and Lightning, you can absolutely go into the Summon Familiar. Now, if you are going to be going into Fire and Lightning damage as a focus rather than Chaos, and Vitality with a kind of a side thing, I would very strongly recommend going into melee weapons, be it two-handed with Searing Might or one-handed with Searing Strike. And at that point, I would probably go all the way to Static Strike if you're focusing on Fire and Lightning. But if you are going to go in that direction, these two combined with Vindictive Flame, plus the Crow, which will eventually give you Lightning Retaliation, which is really nice, and will heal you, by the way. But this would really help out. Your retaliation increases, retaliation here increases. If you're going to go with Fire and Lightning, it actually is a really strong idea to go into Granado at the very least and start busting out some pretty heavy damage. Again, if you're going into Fire Lightning and you're going to use Granado, use Skyfire Granado, please. It's amazing. Actually, if you really wanted to, you could go into Stunjacks and or Canister Bomb as well, grab Concussive Bomb, and then go into Olzuen's Chosen if you really wanted to, but at the very least, Granado is really good for a Fire-Lightning combination, especially if you're melee. That can serve as your ranged attack, really. And then, of course, Fire Strike, you have your Vindictive Flame, which is really nice, so you could also pull that off. But you may also notice that there is quite the potential here for a very interesting combination of Fire and Internal Trauma, or Physical, or Lightning. You could splash Stunjacks, and like I said, a good old Canister Bomb can be very effective in this situation. Bring up Temper, grab even more retaliation damage. Maybe not convert this to Skyfire Granado, it's totally up to you. Go with Temper. Increase physical and internal trauma, absolutely go to town. There's a lot of different ways you can really effectively build this. Now, that being said, obviously with most class combinations, with the exception of the last one where absolutely everything worked, which is amazing, but with most class combinations, most of these classes, there are a couple of skills, there's a handful of skills that don't really flow particularly well, and in this particular combination, those entirely reside in the Occultist. Now, I already mentioned that the Hellfire Mind maybe you don't want because you can't really take advantage of that Aether Resistance drop. That's, again, a personal decision that you will have to make when it comes right down to the brass tacks. Maybe you're swayed by an item towards or away from Hellfire Mind. Totally up to you. But some skills that I would give some serious thought into not including, unless you have an item converting them into one of your major damage types, would be, actually, I'm going to put 3 down here. These 3. Why? Well, first off, Bloody Pox, although it is an incredibly powerful skill and one of my favorites, it does not have a whole lot of overlap with the other damage types that you can really heavily enhance. You can do a certain amount of enhancement of vitality damage and poison acid damage, but only through the use of possession, and this can get kind of messy in terms of being able to work this in very effectively. Generally speaking, I don't find Bloody Pox broadly useful in this particular combination. Same with Dreeg's Evil Eye. Although my walkthrough has been using Dreeg's Evil Eye with great effect for quite some time, eventually Dreeg's Evil Eye is going to fall behind the other damage types as I get more and more constellations, which is a whole different conversation that you can go about. And I intend on doing a devotion examination in the near future, just a one-off episode at the end of this series talking about the various devotions, once you have a grasp of the combinations. But Dreeg's Evil Eye, although it eventually does turn out to grab some vitality damage later on along the way, which of course again can be enhanced, it's not a heavy focus of the combination, so sometimes it's not necessarily worth it as much, so that can somewhat hurt it in the long run. In the short run, it is worth at least playing around with, because you are going to have a problem with Chthonics. Chthonic enemies are pretty resistant to chaos. Well, they're highly resistant to chaos and vitality. They're pretty resistant to fire. They're kind of resistant to poison acid. So Dreeg's Evil Eye can really offset that, but even then, it's not an ideal solution. The only real true solution to Chthonics would be lightning damage. They don't generally tend to do well with lightning damage, broadly speaking. There are always heroes or specific individual creatures among the Chthonics that are the exception, but for the most part, most of them have fairly mediocre, average resistance to lightning, so if you wanted to really have a true solution to Chthonics, you're going to be looking into doing some lightning damage here, whether that be from one of the 3, what I call the device skills, Stun Jacks, Canister Bomb, or Granado, or if you decide to work it through Ulzuin's Wrath here, totally up to you. But that is generally the best, most consistent solution there, and as for Bonds of Bismuil, I don't usually go full pet with this combination, because frankly, it's not very often that I find it useful. Now, does that mean you absolutely should not? No, you can absolutely make a full pet build work. It's just that very often you're working with a build that only really wants one or the other of the 2 pets available to you. It very rarely occurs that you want both pets. Again, it is possible. So, I often don't use Bonds of Bismuil, and I would urge you with this combination, if you are thinking, well, maybe I want to do 2 pets, are you sure? There are some items that will lend themselves to that particular idea, and if you have them, fantastic. But if you don't have those items, or if you're not expecting to otherwise get a hold of those items in some way, maybe wait until you have them. Because this combination is a little rough on a full pet build, because it does only have the 2 pets. And although you can enhance the pets decently well through the use of Flame Touched, at the end of the day, you are very heavily relying on 2 pets, one of which will be spending some of its time healing you, and the other one of which is actually intended to die fairly consistently so it can do that 10% reduction to the enemy's health. So, using a full pet build with the Occultist with its pets alone is somewhat of an interesting and risky proposition. Now, the reason why I didn't bring this up with the Soldier is because the Soldier's field command actually can really increase the survivability of these pets, which somewhat renders the points moot. Although your Hellhound will not be enacting Blazing Death as often, it will be still, in fact, dealing much more consistent damage. Field Command is a very powerful aura boost. But Flame Touch does not. Flame Touch is very specific, and will only enhance one or the other of these at the same time. Flame Touch will give the Hellhound increased fire damage, and will give the Familiar increased lightning damage, but they aren't really going to cross over beyond that. So there is that somewhat small problem. As opposed to Field Command, which will increase all of their damage across the board by a consistent amount, as well as their durability. So, where this isn't so much of an issue with the Soldier Occultist combination, it is a concern here, because Flame Touched, of course, does not increase durability in any way, shape, or form. This is purely aggression. So, if you are thinking to yourself, well, maybe I want to try the full pet build, that's fine, but be properly prepared first. Have some stuff set aside that you can kind of scale your way up into, that either increase the durability of your pets, or increase their damage by enough where they can go down in an absolute blaze of glory, and at least take stuff with them, because you are going to have a hard time with that as a result. If you are focusing on pets, you're putting all of these points into the pets, and you're putting all of these points into Bonds of Bismeal to enhance those pets, and then they just kind of die off a little too fast. Yes, obviously this increases to some extent their durability, but unlike with the Soldier, which had Field Command to increase that durability further, there is no option for that in Demolitionist. So, at the end of the day, that's really where you're going with this. So, that is really kind of where you want to be, what you want to be thinking about. Now, the reason why I don't call out Blood of Dreeg as potentially being inhibiting here is, first off, if you are going to go with a Retaliation build, with the Lightning Retaliation, with Ulzuin's Chosen or Vindictive Flame, with Blast Shield, with Granado, this gives you Acid Retaliation, and Granado will still benefit from that Acid Retaliation, even if it's not the same damage type. Second off, this is a heal. This heals you, and a decent amount, too. 28% health restored is pretty nice. 3, it increases your offensive ability, which means you hit more accurately and you crit more often. 4, if you are going into vitality damage, you can get pretty big benefits to your acid damage from this. So that's really nice in that particular instance. So, there are applications for Blood of Dreeg in a couple of very specific builds for this combination, usually those that revolve around retaliation damage. So, it can be worth considering. It's not one of those skills where it's like, oh, this is going to be really hard to fit in. No, this can fit in decently well. Obviously not with an elemental build, unless you're going pretty hard into the retaliation. If you're going into an aggressive elemental build, maybe this isn't relevant. But even if you're going into, say, just trying to boost up good old destruction here, just having Blood of Dreeg with Aspect of the Guardian, boosting that vitality damage up, getting some extra resistances there, it can be pretty nice, especially with that heal. So, really that is the things you might want to keep in mind when improving this class. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you have any comments, questions, whatever, please leave them down in the comments below. I will read them. If you like this, please like and subscribe. And, as always, have a great 24 hours.